Byron York is the chief political correspondent for the Washington Examiner and author of the book Obsession and a host of the podcast, the Byron York Show. Welcome, Byron. How are you, sir?
Hi, Glenn. I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Good. We've got about 20 minutes, and I want to run through a bunch of things with you. First of all, I was talking to Victor Davis Hanson the other day, and I asked him this question. And your book really this is what your book is about, obsession. The obsession that people had on getting rid of Donald Trump and just destroying him at all costs. And I asked him, when it comes to the media I know hated themselves because they thought that they had, them playing footsie with him helped him get elected.
Right.
But is it just that, or was the media's obsession with this also pushed by the elites in the FBI or the CIA, any of the deep state stuff that saw Donald Trump as a real threat because he was going to upset the apple cart one way or another, and they weren't going to have any of that? Which was the main factor? The press just hating him and hating themselves, or the deep state really kind of juicing that up and pushing stuff at them?
Yeah, that is an incredibly difficult question. You're right. The book is about that. It's called Obsession, and it is about this obsession with getting Trump that began well before he was elected, that continued with the appointment of a special counsel and the whole Russia thing, and then impeachment, and then another impeachment. So there was this obsession. I mean, there were Democrats who introduced a bill to impeach Donald Trump in 2017 for comments that he made about Colin Kaepernick in the NFL. So, I mean, that's where we are. It was an obsession.
Right.
So the question is, you raise a great question. I'm not a really good armchair psychologist, but I do believe that the success of Trump was deeply threatening to a lot of people. It was threatening to some people who felt that they had some manner of input and control over the Republican Party agenda, and they became never-Trumpers. It was threatening to people who believed. You remember this after 2008 and Obama's big victory in 2008. There was a lot of talk of the Obama coalition, a group of minorities and young people, and there was this idea that Democrats had kind of cracked the code and that they would win the presidency from now on, because demographic change, especially the rise of the Hispanic population in the United States, would literally ensure the election of a Democratic president from now on. And they were absolutely stunned that Trump won. But you're right, there's the darker side, the dark underside of that is what the intelligence and law enforcement agencies did during the Trump period. And maybe they were feeling threatened in sort of the same way that others were. But the fact is, they surveilled a presidential campaign, and they did extraordinary things like the meeting, which I still can't get over, on January 6th, 2017, 2 weeks before Trump is sworn in which James Comey, who's then the head of the FBI, asks to brief Trump one-on-one, and he tells him that the FBI has this information about him and prostitutes in Russia. And Comey specifically worried ahead of time that Trump might take it as kind of, and this is Comey's words, a J. Edgar Hoover move. And, of course, the reason Comey worried about that is because it was a J. Edgar Hoover move. And you had these. So what I'm trying to get at here is you had the intelligence agencies, law enforcement agencies doing extraordinary things, the whole dossier, to try to expel Trump, from the system. And so there was this broad obsession, and I think the motivations were different to different people, but it was there, and you're right, it hasn't gone away.
Yeah, and the people who supported Trump, and that includes, most Democrats, most Republicans, whether they were big supporters or not, it doesn't matter. If you're not in line, now it's your turn to be smeared and destroyed. And just when you thought the FBI couldn't get any worse, there's a couple of things. First of all, I read, and I saw your great article rebutting this. The FBI now saying that the Alexandria shooting, the baseball shooting, notice it doesn't have a name. You have to kind of explain it before people even remember it. Right. Where Steve Scalise and all of the Republicans would have been killed if it wasn't by the grace of God. Just this massacre. The FBI comes out and says that wasn't politically motivated. The guy had the names of the representatives in his pocket with physical descriptions. How is this suicide by cop?
Yeah, this was absolutely stunning news. And we just learned this about a week and a half ago. And what happened, everybody does remember, it was June 14th, 2017. The team was practicing. They were in Alexandria. It was all Republicans practicing for the congressional baseball game. Man comes up, asked one of the Republicans, Jeff Duncan, Republican from South Carolina, is leaving early. Man comes up and asked, is this the Republican team or the Democratic team? And Jeff Duncan, having no idea what's going on, who the man is, says it's the Republican team. And shortly after, he pulls out a semi-automatic rifle, begins firing, grievously wounds Steve Scalise. A lobbyist is terribly wounded as well. Two others wounded less seriously. And until the man, James Hodgkinson, is finally killed. So you're absolutely right. He prides himself as a member of the resistance. He's a house inspector in Ohio, and he posts things on his Facebook page like, quote, "Trump is a traitor. Trump has destroyed our democracy. It's time to destroy Trump and company." He was also part of a Facebook group which was called Terminate the Republican Party. So he quits his job, goes to Alexandria, lives in his van with his gun, and waits. And you're right, he specifically targets Republicans. He has a list in his pocket of congressional Republicans he wants to kill. Okay, and so he does it. And there's absolutely no doubt, and he's a big Bernie Sanders supporter for what it's worth. There's no doubt that he attacks these members of Congress because they're are Republicans. It was a clear act of violent, politically motivated domestic terrorism. And if you remember, even at that time, the FBI was telling us that the greatest threat to our national security was violent domestic terrorism. Okay, so FBI, obviously, Hodgkinson is killed at the scene, so there's no manhunt, but they begin investigating this and looking into Hodgkinson. And the shooting is in June, and in November, the FBI has a private meeting with the members of Congress who were there. And the FBI says, "Well, we've discovered the cause," and they say, "Well," and the FBI says, "Well, it's suicide by cop." And the Republicans are just dumbstruck. I mean, they said, "What?" I mean, they literally go, "What?" And they say, look, if you want to commit suicide by cop, you point a gun at police, and that will usually do the trick. You don't go attack Republican members of the House. Besides, there was a small Capitol Police detail at the practice that day because Steve Scalise, House Whip, Republican whip, was a member of the House leadership, so he had a security detail. They were in plain clothes. They were in an unmarked car. The shooter did not know they were there. This was not suicide by cop. There's simply no way in the world it's suicide by cop. One interesting thing is Republicans are often pretty discreet about these things. They didn't leak it. We didn't hear that. This was the FBI told them it was suicide by cop in November of 2017. And we just found it out because one of those Republicans, Brad Wenstrup, who was there that day and played a heroic role, revealed it in a hearing a week and a half ago at the House Intelligence Committee. And he revealed it because he had Christopher Wray, the FBI director, in front of him. So he told him about all this stuff. And you know what Ray's first response was? Well, I wasn't director then. Fine, you weren't director then, but the FBI did this. And so Wenstra sort of demanded that the FBI explain to them what evidentiary and analytical process it went through to determine that this was a suicide by cop as opposed to what it clearly was, a domestic terror attack.
So here's why this is really relevant. They said that Brian Sicknick was, killed in the Capitol riots. They say this is the worst thing that's ever happened, and they're obsessed over all this. Sicknick did not die from injuries at the Capitol. He died of a stroke the next day in the hospital. So they're trying to make this into really an Alexandria kind of moment where it wasn't. It was a horrible, horrible moment, but it wasn't something where they were going in and trying to kill everybody, at least seriously like this guy was. Could have been and was horrible in and of itself. But the media and the FBI seem so focused on only things that come from the right that I don't trust the FBI anymore. And that's saying something, Byron. I've always trusted the FBI and the government. I mean, I've been skeptical, and let me see all the evidence, but I don't trust them at all anymore.
Yeah, I think that is one of the saddest results of the last 5 years. And I think you're exactly right. First of all, I think maybe for your listeners, we should say there are lots of parts of the FBI that do old-fashioned crime fighting. They search for murderers. They search for bank robbers. They search for all sorts of really bad people. And that sort of rank-and-file FBI work is something we should all be glad for. But there was a managerial elite at the top of the FBI that had become incredibly politicized. I mean, they actually had, during the 2016 election, they had both major party candidates under investigation. And I think there's something wrong with that right there. But certainly when we discovered what they did with the dossier, the Steele dossier, in which the FBI actually wanted to hire Christopher Steele to do his anti-Trump research for them in the last months of the 2016 campaign. Absolutely inexcusable. They only had to sort of cut him loose because he was breaking their policy by talking to the press, because all Steele wanted to do was expose Trump and try to defeat him in 2016. And even when the FBI had to cut him loose, they maintained a back channel to him and continued to get what we now know were these entirely false dossier reports. And then there was this sandbagging of Trump that I mentioned earlier, the whole "we know about you and those hookers in Moscow" thing. And then there was the Michael Flynn case. I mean, so I think there's plenty of reason to not trust the leadership of the FBI.
There's the FISA court. Are we ever going to get a final report? Are we ever going to see the final report on any of this, do you think?
Well, there is no final report on this whole thing. Everybody has to piece together as best they can from what is out there. We know that there really is a Durham investigation. I know a lot of conservatives have completely lost faith or hope in that and think it's going to be nothing. But there are some people in Washington who you would all trust, I think, who still think that Durham is going to come up with some interesting stuff. But everything is just a part of the picture. You have to kind of put it together yourself. But clearly the FISA thing, in which the FBI misrepresented the evidence in order to wiretap a former low-level Trump campaign aide, Carter Page,
right?
Because that would be a doorway into the larger Trump campaign. It's not because Carter Page was the most important person in the world. It was because that would open a door into the Trump campaign, which they were investigating during the campaign.
If you're not reading the Washington Examiner and following Byron York, you're reading, I don't know what you're reading. You should be following the Washington Examiner. It is really, really good. We read it every single day. Byron is the chief political correspondent and author of the book Obsession, also another must-read. and the host of the Byron York Show. Thank you so much, Byron. We'll talk again.
Thank
God
you,
bless.
Glenn. It was a pleasure.